in the photography of the past, in particular the 1960s and 1970s. And it goes quite well with an exhibition that's actually on at the Barbican right now, which is Everything is Moving, and some of you may have already seen that. If you haven't, I urge you to do so. I've got a nice panel of 3 people. I'll introduce them, we'll chat, and then we'll have a conversation between all of us. First person to speak is Stephen Moore, who is an artist. He's exhibited at Tate, Britain, and the Photoworks Gallery in London. He's the author of Photography, which is a nice, concise title, I like that. And he's a lecturer at the University of Creative Arts in Farnham. I like the way I'm nodding.
Yes, I agree.
That's good. It's doing well so far. Then we will hear from Sarah Jane, who is on my immediate left. She's a lecturer in the history of art at University College London. She's the author of Common Ground, Photography in Germany during the Cold War, and she's a regular contributor to Frieze, Photoworks, Art Review and Art Monthly. And then next to Sarah, we will hear from Pauline. Pauline is the director of Belfast Exposed, which is a gallery of contemporary photography and a photography resource. I think you're currently starting a research project on the kind of related issue. Is that correct? Good. Okay, now Stephen has, as an artist, wants to try and show some images. We'll see if that works. Stephen.
We'll give it a go. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Cool. Well, it's only really just because when talking about photographs, I find it's useful to go and see the photographs, particularly when there's sort of debates and discussions going on. The debate can get a little bit abstract. So apologies if you can't see them that close up, but some of them are actually upstairs, or at least one of them is anyway, so you can see them very nice and big up there. Okay, so the show upstairs is called Everything Was Moving, as most of you, if not all of you, know. And I've got a little sort of mini subtitle for this as well. This is looking back today, of course, but I've got a mini subtitle for what I'm about to say, which is called Everything Was Moving, Nothing Is Moving. So there's the show upstairs, which is called Everything Was Moving, and it's photography from the 1960s and the 1970s. And one of the ideas of that show, the word moving, is very relevant to that show for all sorts of reasons. There's one of the images to show. One of the main things is that there was a lot of political movement going on, sort of revolutionary movement. Yeah, lots of things sort of happening, I think, is one of the main ideas behind that title. And what we see in that show is a combination of things, actually. One of the things that we see is a sort of more traditional style of documentary photography or photojournalism, perhaps in some cases, which kind of fits that sort of decisive moment kind of idea. So like this Larry Burrows photograph, which you can see upstairs on a much larger scale. There's a moment there, one soldier reaching out to another, and there's a sense of movement, even though it's a still image, a sense of movement. So there's that kind of movement going on there, a moment caught. But also, there's a different style of photography as well, such as, for example, the Shōmei and Tōmatsu work, which, if you've seen the show, you'll have seen a lot of that work upstairs, which is doing something a little bit different. It's much more experimental, and in some ways more directly, explicitly personal work. And also, it's not so much about the decisive moment, or some of it isn't anyway. It's about the moments afterwards, really. So, for example, after the Nagasaki bombing, the bomb being dropped over Nagasaki, this is a sort of warped and twisted bottle that was warped by the heat, but it also suggests human bodies as well, perhaps being destroyed or damaged. So it's much more personal work, and it's much more about sort of things happening after the event, more metaphorical work. So you've actually got kind of another movement, really, a sort of transition from a tendency of one kind of photography going towards another tendency. And in the catalogue to the show, the curator, Kate Bush, talks about the show including both art photography and documentary photography. So you've got a bit of both. But also Jerry Badger talks about the work going from work which is very much about the public, it's the kind of work that will be seen in magazines for the public to see, to work which is much more private, much more personal, and is perhaps in some ways perhaps the more sort of intimate space of the gallery. So moving on to the idea of galleries, something else that happens in, particularly in the 1970s, just to take the UK as an example, is that lots of photography galleries open up. For example, the Photographer's Gallery itself in 1971 opening up that year, and the first show is called The Concerned Photographer, and is very much sort of documentary and photojournalism work appearing in a gallery space. So something else happens as well with that is that I'm making some large leaps here chronologically, but also documentary photography itself sort of changes, perhaps partly because of its position in the gallery. So work becomes more personal, what we're beginning to see upstairs, more contemplative, perhaps less iconic. The Larry Burrows image is arguably a very iconic image, an image that will be known by people, even people who don't go to Barbican exhibitions will know that image. I think we might be able to argue. So these are less iconic images, and they're not meant to be about the sort of the quick hit. They're more contemplative, more meditative images, such as Paul Seawright's photograph taken in Afghanistan after the US battalion followed US response to 9/11. So where are the iconic pictures happening now? Do we just have this nostalgia for the 60s and 70s era? And where are the iconic pictures happening now? Well, one of the places they're coming from, at least, are non-professional photographers. So, for example, the 7/7 bombings, there's quite a well-known image from not a professional photographer, Alexander Chadwick, that was on one of the tube trains on 7/7, and took photographs on his camera phone, put them onto Flickr, onto the BBC website as well. The next day they were on the front of the New York Times. So there's what's sometimes called citizen journalism, we could argue, happening. And also, there it is on Flickr. Also, perhaps not citizen journalism, but in a strange kind of way, maybe soldier journalism, although it wasn't intended as such. Obviously a very different situation, but the photographs that were taken by the US soldiers at Abu Ghraib, which were never meant to be seen publicly, but nevertheless have come to be iconic images from the Iraq conflict. Although it's not all from amateurs, Richard Drew, who's a professional photographer, his photograph of Falling Man from 9/11 has also become a well-known image, an iconic image from that time. So I'm only identifying perhaps tendencies here rather than, I'm not saying this is absolutely, totally definitive. But there's also something else which is happening too, which is rather intriguing, which is that there are some pictures being taken by amateur photographers where they're using things such as Instagram and hipstamatic. So that's a photograph from the London riots taken by a non-professional photographer, but using Instagram, and it sort of looks like it looks like an old photograph that's been sort of dug up from about 30 or 40 years ago. So Instagram kind of adds fake light leaks and damage, and adds a border, make it look like a sort of an older style of print or snapshot. But also you've got photographers such as Damon Winter, a professional photojournalist, and Balas Gardi as well, taking photographs using hipstamatic. And just sort of to finish off, Nathan Jurgensen, who's a writer on social media, he talks about, he wrote an essay which is online called Faux Vintage Afghanistan and the Nostalgia for War. And he talks about using Instagram as a kind of almost a nostalgia for the present. As soon as the photograph's taken, it looks nostalgic. And he says this is a bit of a problem. He said, it almost makes the work instantly as though it's something that's happened in the past and is not a current issue. He says, saturated, vignetted, faded, scratched and portrayed on simulated photo paper, hipstamatic war photographs become framed contemporary conflict, as if the wars were the wars our parents and grandfathers fought. So there's a kind of comfort, immediate comfort in the images. It's something that happened in the past rather than something that's happening now. So basically it avoids the uncomfortable thoughts that go along with citizen or soldier journalism, or also these more recent kind of arty meditations on war and conflict. And so there's another idea of moving here going on. In these pictures there's a lack, the lack of moving is a lack of being moved emotionally. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. you. That was very interesting. I said before beginning this, I'm not sure we're going to really be fighting and disagreeing, because the three of us were actually all at a conference yesterday in Brighton, and we tend to have fairly similar takes on things, but I'm going to be quite provocative, because this is a battle, as it's supposed to be. So what I wanted to do is really just kind of tease out 4 points I've got about the general themes of this panel, the idea of the sort of nostalgic, looking back to a time in the 60s and 70s where it was somehow utopian, somehow radical. Speaking from a younger generation as well, you know, so I'm born in 78, just before Thatcher came in and demolished society, etc. So firstly, I suppose I wanted to say that the conflation of the 60s and 70s, which is something kind of weird that the exhibition upstairs does, is a little bit problematic, because the 60s and 70s, you know, weren't the same thing. Obviously, 68 being a kind of key date for mobilisations on the left, all kinds of, you know, different types of protests. However, you know, there's a global phenomenon in the East with the Prague Spring and various different forms of repression. You know, there are different ways of thinking about even that moment. And I think so that's one thing to maybe tease out, that this conflation is a little bit problematic. Secondly, that it's just so easy to think about the 60s, and let's say we accept the 60s and 70s as a term, it's so easy to think about this time as a kind of era of utopian radicalism and politics, and to think of the present as you know, horribly depoliticized, the spread of neoliberalism, the kind of leeching of social media into, you know, to our private lives, the kind of, you know, retreat from ideology, lifestyle kind of politics, etc., etc. And, you know, I'm not going to in any way suggest that that isn't the case. However, you know, there's a lot to be said for just how much of that was already happening. So the kind of point I wanted to make was that the 60s and 70s, on the one hand, seems to be this amazing time for political and photographic culture, where you have all these incredible photographs of protest and iconic images. It's also exactly the same time that photojournalism dies. It's generally accepted that this is when photojournalism declines. You know, Life magazine folds, lots of these photographers are working for agencies, you know, politicized agencies of the left, began like Magnum, founded by Cartier-Bresson and Kappa. And what, you know, after these major sort of journals and illustrated press folded, all of these, you know, previously quite left-wing photographers started working for the banks. Yes, so 67, just before 68, it's the same year that IBM contracts Henri Cartier-Bresson, who was formerly a photographer for the Paris Communist Daily, you know, to do a huge big photo story in a touring magazine that celebrated man and machine and was all about pushing IBM's global markets, you know, to India, to China, to kind of, as well as that, about PR, you know, so there's a sense that we kind of understand, you know, today to be about this kind of, you know, this reach of capitalism, but it was very much there already. You know, they wanted to sell computers, and they really sort of took over the language of a kind of humanist political documentary practice and humanism, you know, for very corporate ends. So just to muddy political to depolitical a little. The second point I wanted to make is I think there's a real danger of conflating the kind of similarities between protest photography and cultures of protest in the 60s and 70s and today. Whether we're talking about the Arab Spring, and there's been lots of talk about, you know, the importance of photography and the importance of social media in the Arab Spring, and actually, you know, more recently people kind of really criticising that and saying that that's been, you know, hugely overestimated. But, or whether we're talking about Trafalgar Square and the kind of marches that we see, people constantly uploading to Facebook, you know, different banners, different kind of, a kind of individualising process of what protest means. And I think one of the problems is that with today, particularly with social networking sites, with the kind of movement from images of protest taken by, you know, what's now been termed citizen journalists on mobile phones, the supposed democratisation of photography, and this huge bulk of new images, you know, new images of protest, is that it produces a false sense, the idea that, you know, and these images is a very interesting piece at the moment. There's a very important, if you haven't already heard of it, there's a big photo biennial addressing the politics of protest and photography today in Brighton. At the moment there's an interesting piece by the artists Thompson and Craighead that look at the global Occupy movement and its kind of photographic culture, and the culture as it's uploaded onto YouTube, and what this means, you know, what we do with these images, what kind of political agency or action these images have. And I suppose one of the problems with the use of social media is there's a sense that we have a kind of common ground. And I think sometimes that's very interesting possibilities for kind of new forms of solidarity. On the other hand, there are no similarities between people taking photographs in Syria, and being shot in the head by snipers while they're doing it, and people taking photographs in Trafalgar Square and uploading them, or the way we look at Guardian readers looking at all the interesting banners we saw today. So I think that there's a danger in assuming a common ground that doesn't exist. There's a very interesting work by the Lebanese artist Rabia Murray called The Pixelated Revolution that deals exactly with this, that looks at the kind of horrors in Syria. There's also a very important piece by Nagara Zimi, who wrote in the Art Forum last year, where she's dealing with the politics of the image, particularly in terms of the Egyptian revolution. And she says, there's an awful lot of other things going on. It's not simply that, the citizen journalism enabled kind of, and then the social media enabled this sort of very visual, the importance of photography and the visual of Egypt. But there's, the fact that in actual fact Al Jazeera having 24-hour coverage, the fact that Egypt has a very specific kind of film industry and visual culture already present means that, that there was a sense of kind of saturation of the image, which we haven't seen in Syria. That hasn't happened. So there are thousands of people dying, and we're not seeing the images. Yeah. So, okay, so the third point I wanted to make was forms like, to go back to what Stephen was mentioning, that the Instagram, the idea of this retro, the retro look. And obviously there are very real things that are happening in terms of the economies of this. So Kodak, went bust, declares bankruptcy, 2012, the same year that Facebook bought for $1 billion, just before they floated, bought Instagram, really as a means for kind of securing their investment in the mobile market, because Facebook's really banned on mobile, and they wanted to have all of these people, on board. But one of the more interesting things for me is that Instagram is not really, I don't think it is about nostalgia, because I don't think the generation using it are remotely nostalgic about the 60s and 70s. I don't think they really know what that means. I think it's about actually a generation that's been brought up being very computer literate. And what's interesting about Instagram is that it's a movement even further away from these constant kind of textual status updates to thinking about the image as an event, as your status, in a very kind of banal, trite, diaristic, individual way. So instead of being kind of, instead of it representing a culture that's very tired of authenticity and individualism and novelty, I think it's all too fetishistic for individualism, authenticity, which is a pretty problematic word, and novelty. And I wanted to throw out something really interesting. Instead of the Instagram as the kind of mediating technology between the 60s and 70s and the present, maybe the BlackBerry Instant Messenger, which is actually, BlackBerry is one of the few places where you can't use Instagram, being used by all of the really fucked off, dispossessed youth, exactly, lost by the 68 baby boomer generation who looted the streets of London, when we saw the scenes of burning and communicated via BlackBerry. This is a counter model to the leftist, protests. What's going on there generationally? What kind of relationship does that have to the 60s? And finally, I just wanted to stress that I think it's a really big issue here between photography, if we're talking about photography as photo art, or if we're talking about photography as either photojournalism or social documentary, because they're very, very different things. And one of the problems I have with the exhibition, which we can eke out in a bit, is that the conflation between photographs of civil rights movement and protest and magnet photographers and photojournalists embedded in war contexts with people like Zygmunt Popper and Boris Mikulov, who are artists. And that's not to say that one is necessarily less political, because what is interesting, particularly with the photographic cultures of protest today, is some of the places where the most political things are happening to them are actually with photo artists. So I think that's something that we really need to kind of tease out, to think about the distinctions between photography and also photography in and out of the museum. And we can kind of come back to that. And the fact that these categories that once held in the 60s, like the amateur photographer and the professional, don't really exist in the same way now. there's sort of been a disintegration of those things. You know, amateur photography doesn't really, it occupies a very different place, I think, when everybody has a camera and uses it to take pictures. Okay.
Thank you, Pauline. Mike.
I've got 3 points as well. Stay with that. And I think that I would like to start really by looking at the kind of false memory of the 60s and 70s, and both Sarah and Stephen have touched on this. I don't need to go into great depth. I think that many of the photographs that we think, or that we casually recall as the defining images of the 60s and 70s radicalism, it's open to question about how real that is. But nevertheless, these images that we all have them, we close our eyes, we can see them, these defining, iconic images, they absolutely resonate within contemporary visual culture. They do have some meaning today. And I think that photojournalism's claim to authenticity is truly tarnished. And yet somehow, in the digital age, where the mobile camera phone turns us all into the citizen photographer, potentially, the visual repertoire of the clenched fists, the burning barricades, all of it still evinces an aura of belief around contemporary images of protest. And so my first question is really, what does it mean that images of mass protests from the streets and public squares of Cairo and Athens and Tunis evoke photographic memories of the heady days of 60s and 70s militancy? And for some commentators, some would argue that photography, images, past and present, can actually play a very progressive role in preserving and helping us to reproduce the language of civic engagement and political struggle. Predating photography is the iconic picture of Marianne, Courbet's Marianne, which still resonates with us. It helps us to understand what revolution is. We somehow understand it through the picture of Marianne. And she appears again in Tunis and in Athens. She emerges from the crowd, shouting into the face of the police and soldiers. And from this perspective, our captivation with the, albeit cliched, visual rhetoric of protest may express a very real yearning to rediscover a language for protest and dissent, to rekindle passions and revive the spirit of more radical times. But I think that many also will see the danger in this dissemination of the revolutionary image. There's a sort of conservative retreat, a sense of nostalgia, which is the sort of retromania, this idea of retromania, of society's kind of narcissistic fascination with its own recent past. And also the fact that often these images of protest, which recall the 60s and 70s, are actually disseminated across very sort of playful and fictionalized spaces, like YouTube and Facebook. So I think, first of all, my first question really is it real, and what do we mean by reality and authenticity in this context? I think my second point relates to photography itself. I think that photography is suffering because of the political context that it operates within. I'm taking my own experience working in Belfast and commissioning and publishing photography in Belfast during the post-agreement, post-Good Friday Agreement years. And this is decidedly a time where nothing is moving. And we are photographers, serious photographers, who are political and who want to engage politically, are driven by a desire to expose the structures, the systems, the hidden forces that underpin and shape public and political life. And so the challenge for these photographers is not that their work somehow misrepresents real life experience or skirts around the important political questions, but that in drawing attention to the way people have been squeezed out of political life, they may paradoxically be compounding the problem. And in a review of some of the work that we've commissioned, someone wrote, I think it was a very well observed. A sociologist called Chris Billigan wrote this. The absence of people in documentary photography today can be an accurate picture of the position of the people in contemporary society. But this absence can also amount to an attempt to evade the question, where are the people? The people are a spectral presence in the pictures because they are a spectral presence in the city. They are passive consumers in the present, not history-making subjects. The Belfast Exposed photographers have managed, sometimes hauntingly, to capture this, and yet this seems unsatisfactory as the condition that it describes. So finally, just to talk then about the photography of the 60s and 70s, and particularly the photography that's showing upstairs. And again, I would urge everyone to go and see the work. Well, back in the 60s and 70s, as television newsrooms were streaming pictures of war, protest and civil unrest into millions of homes, this new generation of photographers were pioneering documentary forms that sought to express more complex personal perspectives of the world. And I think it's interesting that many of them were actually positioned outside the mainstream, whether the mainstream news media or mainstream society. And I think that's what makes a lot of this work interesting. And it is, I agree with Sarah, that putting the 60s and 70s together is rather an odd thing to do. And so when I was looking around the exhibition, I was looking for the things that connected the work. And what I came away with was the sense that in the work, how different it is. And it's from all over the world, different photographers, working in completely different kinds of societies. So there's work from Afghanistan in the 1960s, the Soviet Union in the 1970s, South Africa, apartheid South Africa, all very different. But what these photographs seem to speak of is change, a sense that things, not that they should change, but they have to change and they will change. Looking at some of the photographs, say, of Goldblatt, David Goldblatt photographs of apartheid South Africa, you see very clearly how anachronistic the white establishment is. They look like things from the past. They look like something from a completely different era, another century. And the portraits of the families, the black families, this wonderful portrait of a group of people at a wedding. And they look as though they're stepping into the future. That these are the people in waiting. And that seems very clear in a lot of the photographs. There's some amazing photographs, I think, that Ernest Cole's photographs, and I absolutely urge people to go and look at this show. You only need to see these photographs. And I think that, again, what's different about those photographs, I feel, from a lot of documentary photography today, what's different about it is that it's not saying to us, bear witness to this. It's not inviting us to express a kind of moral certainty or a moral revulsion for something that's clearly wrong. It's showing us the dehumanizing and the degrading effects of past laws, of poverty, of segregation on real people's lives. But it's not saying to us, this is wrong, bear witness to it. It's saying, this is so wrong that it cannot last. You feel when you look at it, and Ian Jeffrey, the art historian, actually, when he was reviewing Cole's House of Bondage, says something I think is really insightful. He says that this work protests about present crimes in the context of what might have been. So the work opens up not only the necessity or the hope of change, but the absolute certainty of change. It offers you not moral certainties, but moral choices. And again, with just to finish really, with Boris Mikhailov, and again he's working in a completely different context. living through the social disintegration of Soviet Russia. And he said that he chose to be a photographer as a way of realizing himself as a citizen and as a human being, not simply to look at, but to engage and to show what was real. And I think that this kind of photography that was being made at this time, what is special about it, what distinguishes it, really is that it may not express the power to mobilize public opinion or force revolutionary change. It is recording things that are happening around it. But in telling the world anew, it shows me the way that photography can be and can become truly radical and transformative.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a very rich discussion between these three people that I want to try and pursue a little with your help. I suppose the question that I have is that when I was listening to some of the last remarks that Pauline was making, is that this clearly seems to be about mankind's relationship to change, and photography exposes that or reveals that. But it's very easy today looking back because we knew things had changed. So are we not romanticising it ourselves a little bit when we looked at those photographs because we know that things did happen? So is it in the photograph or is it in our minds?
Absolutely, very good question. I mean, obviously we did. We're in the position where we know what came next. And actually what came next was not always progressive. The photographs from show us Afghanistan in the 60s. And actually there is the catalogue we talk about the fact that they show bear baiting. So there are dogs attacking a bear in obviously what looks like a village square, with lots of people sitting around watching. And they're quite violent and strange. And there's a suggestion that by the curators that somehow this prefigures the doomed intervention by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is there. And you think, well, right, okay. These are taking about 5 years before the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. But nevertheless, you do cast back, in other words. So we knew what followed. We knew that that Afghanistan was about to enter decades and decades of war. We know this. And so we do cast back. But I think that even in casting back, I think that I think there's a difference between reading historically, looking at something and reading with the knowledge of what happened next, and a kind of fanciful nostalgia where you just completely make it up. Because I think there is, you knowing what happened next simply gives us a greater insight into what we're looking at, in a sense. It gives another dimension to the pictures.
Do you agree, or do you
well, I nod all the time. I think it's but I'm certainly not nodding off. It's a fascinating session. But I think I think it's perhaps something that is inherent in the nature of photography, isn't it? That the photography is despite the fact that a photograph is that, or seems to be that moment frozen in time. The gesture I'm making now will be frozen in that photograph that has been taken. But at the same time, the world carries on. It's a false kind of, it's a fantasy that the photograph seems to freeze the moment. And in a way, talking about Kodak, you mentioned Kodak earlier on, Sarah. Kodak is one of the people responsible for making us think of photography like that, actually. And make us think that photographs are good ways of recording memories, which actually, people like Jeffrey Batchin would say that photographs are a terrible, terrible way of recording memories. There's all sorts of, you might be thinking, God, it's really hot in here, or something. Yeah, that photograph that's just been taken will never record that element. So time carries on. And I think it's very interesting in the show that you've got things like Tōmatsu's photograph where you've got the watch stopped by the Hiroshima bomb. And so it's forever fixed at 2 minutes past 12, I think it is, something like that. Something like that. But actually, every photograph of a watch, unless the hands are blurry, if it's an analog watch, unless the hands are blurry, then all of them could be stopwatches, because the photograph freezes the moment. So it's that strange thing of the way that photographs freeze time, but time carries on. This thing we invented really, that calls time carries on. So every photograph is going to be changing almost from instant to instant. I suppose the other thing that shows, like you mentioned, the geographical sort of space of it, and that, that's another thing that changes the interpretation of the photograph is the geographical space of the picture. So I suppose it's kind of, what's nice about the show, I think, very useful about the show, is it points up, just look at those sort of, in a way, historical photographs, how the meanings change. And I suppose the way we can now think about like the photographs that are being made now, the very recent photographs, Arab Spring photographs and so on, and it makes us more aware of the fact that in 10 years' time we'll be looking at those in a very different way. But we can't say what way that's going to be. I hope that makes some kind of sense.
It's impressive with the Arab Spring. I always wonder if they're hoping the photograph will do it for all of us. Does that make any sense? So there's a kind of wishful desire when I look at the photographs of the Arab Spring that it will somehow lead to political change.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. It's another thing, I mean, I can't quote Jeffrey Hatch, it happens all the time, I'm afraid, but there's something else that I think it's Jeffrey Hatch that talks about photograph being a plan for nostalgia, which is never more accurately represented than in actually sort of what is really the majority of photography, which are snapshots. And Fortune magazine said that actually 10% of the photographs that exist in the world were made last year. And most of those photographs are snapshots made on digital cameras. And snapshots are the ultimate sort of example of nostalgia, really, because you go on holiday or it's your birthday or whatever, and you've got to get that snapshot just right because you're thinking, I'm going to look back on this time.
I think I disagree.
Oh,
Okay, I've got several things I disagree with.
Cool.
So I don't know where to begin. I'll begin with my first. I'll disagree immediately with what you said.
Okay.
And I'll disagree with some things that I said a little bit a while ago. I don't know that nostalgia, I mean, a snapshot is a snapshot. A snapshot made on a Kodak, made on a point-and-shoot camera is a very different thing to a mobile phone endlessly taking, which I think has a really different temporality. Like it's kind of just constantly now. Blackness, nowness, status, update, here I am. I don't think anybody's thinking necessarily about looking back on those things in the same way you do, in a family album or etc. But I also wanted to pick up because what you both spoke about was the idea of the importance of a photograph being iconic. And I think what's missing from the exhibition and what's missing from, this is a huge problem that has, been debated about endlessly in terms of social documentary and photojournalism, is that the more iconic a photograph is, the more kind of dangerous it is. The more it can be used, it can be put to all kinds of uses and abuses from completely different political. So I remember talking to a photojournalist who'd taken a famous photograph of somebody hammering in the Berlin Wall, and what was fascinating is about the different ways in which people had used these images from absolutely, one image, very iconic, from the left, from the right, from Christian, from, fascist, communist. I mean, the point is, I think, and there's a lot of literature, the Migrant Mother, Dorothy Lang's favourite, this idea that does an iconic photograph, can it mobilise, if it has a compassionate emotive effect, can it mobilise change? Or can it be more instantly aestheticised and turned into a conservative object of contemplation because it's nice to look at? And I think the fact that a lot of social documentary photographers work in series exactly against, the one singular iconic image. And that this moment that becomes really interesting in the 70s that isn't in the exhibition is the point when not only photojournalism flounders because of TV, because of the collapse of the kind of big magazines like Life, Fortune, where these photographs were, it's no longer the most important way of representing what's happening around the world. But also you have the new left, people like Alan Sekula, Martha Rosler, at San Diego, saying, this is absolutely deconstructing what it means from a political perspective, taking documentary apart, taking photojournalism apart, taking the idea of, an icon, or criticising humanism and compassion as potentially reactionary. And I think that doesn't feature, and they're doing it. What's interesting is that they're doing it from a photo art perspective. They're not documentary photographers. Another thing that their work, that 70s work, is all about is the importance of the text and the caption and the relationship between the image and the text, which is something that's also open to be discussed. And something that's interesting, I think, when you think about the Instagram. The other thing I wanted to pick up on was points when you said something like a playground of fictionalized spaces when you're talking about YouTube and Facebook. And I think this is really dangerous. I think we're all idiots to think that Facebook is a playground of, it's the most sort of sophisticated form of corporate and other surveillance. I mean, we all offer up like our personal selves into a site that you're being like manipulated in a million ways by a million different corporations. And this idea, it's the same with the Instagram. And this idea that this is a statement that the CEO of Instagram made before he sold it, of the Insta universe, the Instagrammatic universe, which is a happy place. It's all happy. It's like some kind of mad version of the 1955 Family of Man show that Edward Schleicher put on at MoMA, which was the most successful photo show of all time, that showed a world, at that point, post-Hiroshima and Nagasaki, entering the Cold War madness of happy people, of everybody being happy. Arguably at that point, in 1955, there was a real political momentum for that kind of utopia. I'm kind of quite pro-Schleicher, and I think there's a lot to be said for what he was trying to do, but with the kind of this saccharine idea that Facebook and YouTube is a safe, friendly place, is really dangerous.
Yes, can I see hands whilst you come back?
Yeah, I'd like just to come back quickly on that, because I think in fairness, what I meant was that, I think people no, I know you won't. I think what I meant was that, Facebook is a place where we think of it, it's not real, it's fictionalized. I mean, I think that's really, but I think more important than that, and I think the idea that, the switch from, okay, photographs are not real and we are being critical of them now, and what you're talking about, the kind of critical theory that's where we turn our attention to the photograph and we say, this photograph is misleading, or it is saying the opposite of what actually is. It's subverting reality. And our understanding of the kind of unauthentic nature of photography, it was important. But I think the problem is that what happens is that you actually say that the photograph is somehow all-powerful. The photograph is the place where morality resides. You look at the photograph, which is a flat object, two-dimensional object. In a sense, you fetishize the photograph. So the photograph, then, we are all enthralled to the image. We and people can't make moral choices because they're enthralled by images they're saturated by them, they're confused by them. And I think that a lot of the arguments in that kind of reaction to the sort of Family of Man and that rather innocent approach to photography is...
although it was used by Eisenhower as absolutely explicit.
Yeah, but I think we've kind of gone so far down that road, that idea that we're all enthralled to the man and it's about PR and people are so helpless that they are unable to think as a saturated images. I think that's quite condescending. I think that condescension. So I'd just like to point out that I think that condescension towards is example. I think that morality and agency exists outside.
In consideration of the content we will pause what I think it might be for tonight's concert. Okay. The concert will start at 7:30. Thank you.
Yes.
I'm not an expert on photography, especially not on more contemporary stuff. I just want to just say something about having been to the exhibition upstairs and, finding it really powerful, always bringing me to tears with some of the images there. But one of the things that I kind of felt that may be different, with photography today is that there seemed to be a real connection there between the photographer and their subjects in some kind of way. I remember one of the David Goldblatt one, being from South Africa, I kind of felt, empathy with that sort of thing. But I remember he went to this mining compound and he was told, I think he wanted to take photographs of miners, but the employers made them dress up, this tribal costume, and he didn't want these kind of posed pictures, and he was going to walk away. But he felt intuitively the kind of the dignity of these people, that they felt proud to be, they posed for him. He sensed a certain dignity in their regalia, in their poses, and so he stayed and took the photographs, and they are quite sort of moving in their kind of way. And somehow I can't kind of believe that people taking photographs of the Occupy movement or even the Arab Spring have a connection with what they're taking the photographs of today, because that's something that's lacking, seems to be lacking today between people. One of the things about the Occupy movement was the lack of connection between everybody in it in some ways. They were all muddled together, but there was very little connecting them, and I can't feel people taking photographs of them would find a point of connection in the way that I felt these photographs.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats in the Barbican hall. This evening's concert will begin in 10 minutes. 10 minutes.
Last slide.
Late time and remitted will be emitted during the concert at suitable points
We're going to take Sarah and then let's see the other one.
Thank you.
I thought that you wanted to have Sarah first, so I was
just going to respond.
I thought it would be microphone, Meg, sorry.
Okay, I'm going to take the call. Sarah.
I just wanted to respond briefly. Well, first of all, I think it's like a massive issue. We keep on talking about the photographer and the person who's looking at it, so that doesn't work. Very specific, different photographic cultures of production and reception and dissemination. I think one of the things about, a mobile phone doesn't make you necessarily, well, does it or does it not, doesn't necessarily make you into a photographer, right? And there are still professional protest photographers taking photographs of the Occupy movement that are very different to the kind of photographs that are being taken by everybody present and uploaded. So David Hoffman, who's a very interesting London-based, he's taken huge history of taking photographs of protests in London. And as an elected photographer, you've got a very different kind of politics already. You've got a completely different. Often you're battered by the police. You're one of the first people to get battered. You get your camera taken off you. There's a kind of level of, I think, demarcation in what you're doing and what you're trying to do and who you're trying to represent, which is quite different to a kind of subjective way. So the idea of citizen photography, I think, is quite difficult, because I don't think we all go around and go, I'm a citizen photographer today. Today I'm being a citizen photographer.
Please take your seats in the Barbican hall. This evening's concert will begin.
And there's something very different about the form of those photographs. So a traditional black and white documentary photograph, that is entering into the kind of aesthetics of that. There's all kinds of things. The fact that, the veracity of black and white, but the distance from reality of black and white, the idea, I think there's so many complicated things about what that is. And I think one thing to say about the idea, that the politics of compassion is a huge and complicated issue, isn't it? How you actually make that connection, who you're representing, how you're representing them, what the politics of that representation is, whether there's a problem with representing, this is another big debate within documentary of representing those silenced or, the poor or the destitute or and othering them and fetishizing them and making them. So I think it's very difficult to not unpack all of those things.
Okay, Elizabeth, and then Pauline, then you. I've got you.
Thank you.
confused. I don't understand what actually is said here about the present. When the title of the session is really interesting, looking back today. So the reason why I think we're looking back is to understand the differences between the past and the now. And the experience that we have and the knowledge that we have with our judgment of the past is usually the product of yes, looking back, and what we see is that the terrain for change was ready. An example: James Joyce wrote Ulysses because Freud came a decade before with the interpretation of dreams and the subconscious, and so there was a place there where you have this piece of literature. So when you're talking about the 60s and 70s and the change that was there is because the photographer was breathing up that change. It's not because we are now, and so we can look, yes, it was true, but it was a real thing. So what is it today? When you mention these photographs without people, immediately you have a very remoteness from the photographer with the engaging of society. What you see is a flat type of piece where there is static and flatness. And so I agree, nothing is moving today, but I would love to hear more about why is it that nothing is moving today.
Pause, you're not allowed to answer yet, so I'll take the one behind you.
Hi, my question is to Stephen and Sarah, I think you already have answered. It's my endless fascination with Instagram. I don't have it, but I constantly get sent pictures of kittens.
I've never used it.
Yeah, okay, well, and my question is basically, I'm really interested in the idea of sort of, I agree with you that it's, the people who use this are not interested in history, but they use this form of making something historical that's in itself sort of meaningless, it's imposing history on completely meaningless things. Kittens, food, or whatever, sunsets that I get sent. And the idea of this desperate need to give meaning to the postings that are constantly going on, I find it really interesting. I would like to hear both of your different points of view, which I'm sure I'm going to get.
I'm not going to send any more pictures of cats on Instagram, that's for sure. There's a gentleman there. We don't have much time, so I'm going to take everybody from the audience before I come back to you for final remarks, and then we can keep talking. So.
Okay. It seems to me that the photograph which most these days, which most accurately reflects the period we're in, is those ones that of photographs of protests, where in the image the police are taking photographs of the crowd, and the crowd are taking photographs back of the police, and there's kind of not really very much going on. There's kind of no action. We live in a time when politics has died, basically. So I just kind of, there was an interesting question in the original blurb of the website, which I kind of wanted each of your thoughts on, because the question was, do we need new photographers willing to change the world, or merely to explain it? And I'd just like you to say which you think it is, because I think that's quite an important question just now, because a lot of the time it seems to me that with nothing going on, the type of photographs we have just now are ones that try and artificially create news, which seems to me to be a bit of a dangerous thing. So should we be willing to take a step back and kind of go for a much more kind of objective documentary type of photograph that kind of try to explain things, or should we try to actively create the world through photography?
answer all those questions, but we will have time to answer one.
Yeah, no, I haven't seen the exhibition upstairs, but I did see Don McCullum at the Imperial War Museum, which I guess, you know, for me was you know, fantastic to follow his life through his photographs. You know, the first one was the gang in North London around Finsbury Park that he took, and that made his name. And he was just a working class guy who sort of got a camera, but the whole thing behind him was that he wasn't necessarily that he was political, but he was sort of basically interested in violence, you know, and that's what took him through that period. And to get that energy from those photographs, you know, for me was, yes, whether it's nostalgia, I can't look at a photograph today of the same, to have that same feeling. Obviously, yes, we're looking back at a sort of historical period. The photographs he took during the 60s and 70s, the war photographs, Vietnam, in Northern Ireland, Cyprus, the connection for me was that this was something that was relevant back in Britain, back in our society. But unfortunately, if you take a photograph today of the Arab Spring or of another conflict, you know, we're totally detached from that. In fact, they're taking the photograph to sort of try and say, you know, we need to help. It's not the same as the photographs that he took in that period.
Okay, we're going to take the final gentleman there, and then it's your last remarks, so think about them in all things.
The history of photography is, in a sense, a history of technology. I was wondering whether we look at photographs differently nowadays from how we looked at them during the 60s and 70s, when, as a teenage photographer, it involved a rather difficult and dangerous process of being in a dark room with chemicals which were dangerous and so forth. And therefore, the photograph that was produced at the end of this process is perhaps something one looked at slightly differently from the ones which are produced as easily as they are today.
Stephen, your final remarks. You don't have to answer everything, just what you think.
Well, I was going to say about the Instagram thing, if that's okay. I mean, I'm very interested to talk about all of it, but maybe afterwards. But yeah, the Instagram, I mean, actually, I do think there is an element of nostalgia in Instagram. And I have seen this. I researched Instagram. I spoke to people about why they use it, and actually, you know, a lot of people that use it more than anything else that I'm aware of are my students at Farnham, and most of them are, particularly ones that are about sort of 18, 19, 20. And actually, I have a theory about this, because I think you're nostalgic for things that you can just about remember. I think that's the heart of nostalgia. You know, when I was a student, I was very nostalgic for like the early 1970s. I was born in '71, same year as the photographer's gallery, and I was extremely nostalgic for the kind of things I could pick up in charity shops, the kind of clothes I'd wear, the kind of records I could buy, all that kind of stuff, and did work as an artist about that. And I see this with students, because a lot of my students, they were born in the early 90s, and so they were born just at that moment where digital cameras were kind of just, well, yeah, from there, when they were about sort of 5 or 6, just beginning to get used. And they can't really remember when analog was the main form of photography. I'm talking about photography here as in like snapshots, things that most people...
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats in the Barbican Hall. And
I want to stand up for nostalgia, because I think nostalgia would be a really good thing. And I think there's a lot of creativity that comes out of nostalgia. So I'm going to say nostalgia. I'm not going to take my seat. I'm going to stand up for nostalgia. Except I'm not going to sit down. But yeah, nostalgia, it can be a good and creative thing.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, try and respond to all of them quite quickly. I think nostalgia can be a good thing. I think nostalgia, when it's purely about fashion and aesthetics and form and not content, is a little more problematic. Can any of these kids use a camera, analog camera?
They can after they do that course.
Right, well, of course, it's serving an important function, I'd say. I think there's something interesting. I mean, there's a very basic thing, is that the Instagram kind of artificially puts the materiality back into the photograph. It's had it sucked out of it by the process, by digitalization.
But I think it's not just about the individual, it's also about the way these kind of languages and aesthetics are used as well. So I found a really like sinister quote by the head, the digital head of Pepsi, Josh Karp, who said, "We use Instagram to humanize our brand." And I think that's an interesting issue as well, that it works both ways. So the idea that there's this very kind of like, individual, subjective, kind of, that embraces the look of the 70s and the blur and the fuzziness and these warm edges, and also being mobilized by giant corporations. So it's complicated. I like, I'm all for materiality and objects and analog. I learned how to develop photographs when I was doing my A-levels and still take photographs, etc. On the idea of photographs changing the world or explaining it, I hope they can do both. And I think it's also about the use that photographs are put to. And that gets ever more complicated when different fields break down. So when you have this kind of slight disintegration or muddying of the boundaries between the professional photographer and the amateur and the artist, I think then you get some quite interesting things. And I think the photograph of Lindy England, and what's interesting about that is that the ways that the politics that can mobilise almost accidentally, without a big, without the photojournalist who has a moral kind of political goal to change the world, that can act as a catalyst for kind of change, hopefully. The last one was about the history of technology, and I think absolutely it is a history of technology, and technology is also produces different kinds of spectators. And it can be hegemonic, it can be ideological, it can be freeing and liberating, it can be all of those things. And I think there's a politics of a general culture of the way we look at photographs definitely changes. If you think about from the 19th century to now, it's what makes it such a fascinating and slippery. And it's why I love teaching history of photography, because you can never say anything without them saying the opposite.
Pauline.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to the point that was raised about the relationships between the people in the photographs and the photographer. I think it's a very important point because I think particularly looking at the work Malik Siddiqui, I wasn't actually familiar with this work, but see it. And these are these really cool people. They're just so hip and so cool, and they're so real, and they're just real and relaxed. And they look a bit retro because there's one I think called Four Men all in the same suit or something, and it's like a row of kind of four tops dancers in the 60s and things.
Really good friends.
Really good friends dressed the same. It's just so real, and it's just the people in the photos looking at you are just so fresh and so real. You'd really like to get to know them, and they're not acting out. And of course, they didn't, that was then, and this is now. And I think that we are kind of so knowing now. We're so knowing that it's really hard. It's wonderful when you encounter that kind of freshness. And it is to do with the relationships. I mean, the relationships seem more relaxed. And we are terribly worried now about the way we relate to other people. And are we observing the right rules? Is it ethical? Is it right? Are we exposing? Are we being exposed? And so on. There's so much hedging around that. But there is a freshness there and a kind of innocence, which I think is endearing and makes us yearn to go back to that time. Of course, the point is we can't, and there's no easy way back no road back to some sort of golden age. And I think that for photographers today, they do struggle, and that there is a kind of sense that we're working in some straitjacket of a culture that is very skeptical of authenticity, and skeptical of the possibility of the new, and of the human subject. It doesn't believe anymore, and we can't just go back and start believing again. And I think that often the nostalgia is just to do that thing. Someone said it in an earlier debate or discussion today that actually being free is very difficult. It is hard work, and I think that's what I'd like to end on. It is hard work, and I think that you've got to keep looking for what's out there. I think that one of the things that perhaps I would take from looking at photographs from the 60s is the curiosity, the willingness to look outside and to look for new things. I think that curiosity is really important. I think also it's important to believe in other people, write people off or to assume that we know it all anyway. I think people will surprise us, and there's always something surprising around the corner. So maybe it's the photographs or the photographers can't do it. They're not going to change the world, but the world will change anyway.
No, I have to say, I began that discussion feeling a little tired, and now I'm planning in my head a whole conference on photography and nostalgia and what it means, and overanalyzing my use of Islamic perhaps. That was really, really useful. Can you join me in thanking this panel?